welcome back to Beholder to No One, a D&D podcast. Today we are here with Connie from Transplanar.
Hello, hello.
And Greg and I are here to basically get our education on and learn a little bit about anti-colonialism in games and how it currently is represented and what's a better way to basically get good, for lack of a better explanation. Get good.
G-U-D.
Yeah.
So before we get onto that topic, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your experiences in TTRPGs and a little bit about Transplanar as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that introduction. As you know, my name is Connie. My pronouns are they, he, and she. I am the GM and executive producer behind Transplanar RPG, which is, if you don't know, it is an all-transgender, person of color-led, 100% homebrew D&D 5th edition / general tabletop actual play live-streamed campaign. And our main campaign and GM advice series currently stream on alternating Saturdays at 3 p.m. Central on Twitch. So that, in a nutshell, is what I am and who I am and what I do. In terms of my experiences with TTRPG, I got into GMing and playing Dungeons & Dragons, I would say probably the winter of 2016. So it's been maybe like 4 years at this point. But my approach to tabletop is very like roleplay, narrative driven. And in that regard, I've been doing improv comedy and just acting in general for over 12 years, performing it. And I feel like, you know, my experience with live performance, as well as like understanding character and acting has really carried me a long way in understanding how to be a good GM, how to be a good player. And I also graduated in the summer of 2019 with a double major that I designed myself in screenwriting and critical race studies. So for a really long time, I've been thinking about story, the craft of writing, as well as how representation, how various axes of marginalization all factor into the stories we tell about ourselves and each other.
Wow.
But yeah, that's my background in basically a quick little nutshell.
Well, first off, congratulations on graduating.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. I'm glad I beat the pandemic.
Yeah, for
That's
sure.
always exciting, especially
Mhm.
creating your own double major is very cool.
For sure.
I like that it was a mix in something that I'm sure you're very passionate about, and then something that was also very interesting and like something that you could do for fun as well. So
Mhm.
it's always interesting. I kind of went with the boring single major of health administration, which was not my favorite choice or my first choice, but here we are.
Mm.
So Greg and I are both fairly new to this topic. So this is definitely a education for both of us. When you first brought up the topic idea, I was like, can you clarify so I don't look stupid on my own podcast? But I'm about to call myself out on my own podcast.
Sure.
But it was more in the sense of I've been playing for a while, but I never really thought about where the stories that I'm playing come from. It was just, it's a D&D game. It's a insert other system game here. It's not, it's from this folklore. It's from this country. It's from this place. And then when you pointed it out, I'm like, oh shit, you're right. They all do kind of fall in the same category. And the main ones that I can think of that I've played, like the actual campaign books, are Wizard of the Coast, where they all kind of had the same feel and they don't really branch out beyond a certain thing. And I never even thought about it. And I think a lot of people might fall into that same category where they didn't really think about it.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I definitely 100% fall into that category. And I've actually had you, Nikki, explain this topic to me, I think a total of 3 or 4 different times, including last night when you were over at my house. And I still am not 100% sure what exactly it is we're speaking of today.
So I guess the first question is, what is anti-colonialism?
Too many syllables.
Yes. What is anti-colonialism, and where should somebody start with starting to learn this topic?
Totally. So to understand anti-colonialism or any sort of decolonizing framework, you have to understand what, I mean and what other people mean by colonial in the first place. So historically, this is a term just at its very basic definition. When you think of colonial, you think 13 colonies of the United States, right? It's the British colonies. You might think British colonies in India. You might think, et cetera, et cetera. So at the most basic definition of colonial, it means usually one kingdom, country, or other sort of national power populating another country that is not theirs to begin with people with their own settlements. So that's basically what the Pilgrims were. They were a colonizing project. They were fleeing persecution in the UK, and they came to the United States and they set up colonies. They began to propagate and populate there. So that, at the very baseline fundamental definition of colonial is what that means. But when we talk about colonialism, then it expands beyond just this basic understanding and into a more systematic way of looking at colonial projects. So when we think about colonialism, we think about how a lot of European countries historically, Portugal, Spain, Britain, basically all of Western Europe, during the quote-unquote Age of Discovery, spread their ships all over the world to, South America, to countries in Africa, to countries in Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, to North America, and basically set up outposts for trade and also, to conquer the native and indigenous populations there. And we see specifically in the United States, the project committing genocide against Native Americans and continuing to commit genocide against Native Americans, and to basically push the indigenous peoples out of their native homelands and seize those lands for themselves and for their people who did not originate from the Americas. So it is, when a lot of anti-colonial scholars talk about colonialism, they talk about it in the sense that it's an ongoing project. So a lot of people are like, well, that stuff all happened 200, 300, 400 years ago, right? It doesn't matter anymore. But that's not true. That's, it's similar to how we talk about racism and about the legacy, for example, in the United States of chattel slavery. It has systematic consequences that continue to this day that we see, for example, when it comes to anti-Black racism and slavery. We see it in the prison industrial complex. We see it in environmental racism. We see it in redlining. Obviously, we've seen it in Jim Crow laws and in segregation, and the legacy of these systematic racisms that continue to this day. So colonialism is similar. When we look at, for example, are either of you familiar with what a banh mi is?
No.
Not at all.
It is a kind of Vietnamese sandwich. It is made with meats and a pate and breads. And you eat it. It's really delicious. It's really yummy.
Okay, it sounds good.
It's really good. But the banh mi sandwich is Vietnamese, and it is made, the bread that it uses is a baguette. And the reason for that is because of French colonization in Vietnam. And they brought the baguette over. And, the people, actual Vietnamese people were like, you know what, we can make some good food out of this after the French officially left Vietnam. That's where the banh mi came from. So when we think about modern, the modern effects, it's like the butterfly effect, right? It flaps its wings. We're still feeling the ripples today. We look at the banh mi. This is a result of colonization.
Just look at the sandwich up and it looks delicious.
Yes, it is absolutely extremely delicious. But yeah, it has a bloody history, like many beautiful forms of art. And that's sort of where I want to segue into Dungeons and Dragons. Any sort of media, really. I think tabletop is different from things like film and television because it's a game, right? And like any sort of game, it's interactive.
Right.
And the players aren't just audience members. We're not just sort of passively consuming this product that, a writer's room came up with, or some white dude sitting hunched over at his, screenwriting software came up with. We are not only interacting with media with a set of rules, but we're also making a story together out of it. So I want to talk about the interactive aspect of Dungeons & Dragons. I think a little bit down the line, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself. when we think about colonial ways of playing games, first of all, I think there's a very obvious way of looking at it. A lot of games are just rooted in Western European folklore, right? It's like when we think of like medieval fantasy, we think Game of Thrones, right? Like we think like the King's Road, we think like serfs and peasants and lords and domains and dungeons and stuff like that, which is, I think, where a lot of the original, the originators of Dungeons and Dragons, that was their approach to medieval fantasy because, that was their culture, and that's the kind of texts they were used to reading. And in and of itself, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but when that becomes the only possible way of imagining fantasy, I think that's where some of the problems come out.
Right. That
makes sense.
Yes, exactly. But when we think historically, if we look at specifically Dungeons and Dragons and how they've tried to represent, let's say, cultures that aren't necessarily theirs, right? Other cultures. The main one that jumps to mind for me is Oriental Adventures, I think, which came out originally for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I think back either in the 70s or 80s, but I can't be exactly sure.
I think it was 85 when I looked it up yesterday.
Actually, I think you're right. 1985, yeah. It was when the first, because they came out with 2 rule books. The second rule book came out in like early 2000s, I think. And it has been heavily criticized, I think, especially nowadays. The Asians Represent channel. They are a project for, by, and about Asian people. They recently finished reading through the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons version of Oriental Adventures, unless I'm mistaken. They did a podcast, like Twitch stream series about it, where they basically went through it word by word and picked it apart, discussing why and how it was basically extremely Orientalist, which brings me to the second part of what I want to talk to, which is Orientalism and how it's related to colonialism. Orientalism is a term that was coined by Edward Said in his work of the same name, Orientalism, and it is used to describe something is Orientalist when it is portrayed in a way, specifically that the West understands the quote-unquote Orient. It is a construction. So when we think about Orientalist tropes, we think like the classic like Chinese dragon lady, right? Like kind of like the domineering kind of sexy, whatever. Or we think like the geisha, right? These are Orientalist tropes and images that are sort of embedded in Western cultural imagination. So when we talk about Oriental Adventures, first of all, the name itself, Oriental is kind of an outdated term at this point. It was probably used maybe 20, 30 years ago to describe Asian people, but now it's considered offensive. So the fact that it was called Oriental Adventures in the first place is kind of meh, but even if it were called something like Asian Adventures or Adventures in the East, like that would, its content is still kind of cringy. And again, like the Asians Represent project really does like a deep dive into this about exactly like at the granular level, like why it's offensive and why it is, in a lot of cases fetishistic. But, to sort of boil down this very normative, I think, portrayal of Asian cultures in medieval fantasy, specifically when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons, it is, it's imaginary. It is completely fabricated. It is based off of sort of book research, I would say. Excuse me, this is my cat. I need to eject him. Excuse me, Mr. Baba. Jump off. I'm gonna redo that just in case you wanted to get a clean cut of that.
I'm honestly perfectly fine with keeping the cat in.
Great. I think it's very endearing. I'm glad y'all are cool with it. But when we think about how Oriental Adventures has obviously a very Orientalist portrayal of various Asian cultures, we think about the way in which I think they had like an honor system. And they had like a lot of like the descriptions were like, oh, your supplies, like your rations are rice. And like you have like a samurai class, I think. So it was, first of all, it was an amalgamation of a bunch of extremely different, diverse Asian cultures. It was like an amalgamation of Mongolian, Chinese, I think, Japanese. Like they just sort of mashed it together and called that the Orient.
So they just like were like, these are the cool things I like about Asia in general, not any particular one type of Asian. I'm going to steal all of it and put it in a book and then just make it worse, probably.
Yes, exactly. A very Orientalist approach to, I think, representing cultures that are not your own is to sort of grab, like, just reach into the bag and grab a bunch and mash them together, because who cares, right? It doesn't matter. They're all Asian. Asians are all the same, right? And, mashing it together and picking and choosing the parts you think are cool. Like, ooh, I think katanas are cool. Ooh, I think samurai are cool. Ooh, let's do something with tea or like chi or whatever, like that's a very Orientalist approach.
That actually brings a good point, though. So I recognize two things you've already said in the last 2 minutes that are in D&D, like key points for monks, and then there is a samurai class also in D&D 5th edition. Are those done well, or are those problematic in any form of way, or is it like inspiration, like they used it as an inspiration and it's I haven't looked at the lore of them, so I don't really know.
I can talk more about the monk class than I can about the samurai class. I'm not very familiar with the mechanics and the flavor text of the samurai class, but I'm fairly familiar with the monk class because it is part of the standard player's handbook. I have extremely mixed feelings about the monk class. I think boiled down, my feelings are mostly positive because a part of me is like, well, I don't want everything that's, vanilla D&D to just be straight up Western European folklore, right? Like, I kind of want people, and I want us as a culture, as a community, to move away from Western European mythos as the standard, and I want to, as a Chinese person, I challenge white people, I invite white people to be reflexive about it, but to, look at cultures that are not their own, and to that extent is why I think the monk class, the fact that it is a hand-to-hand combatant using ki, that in and of itself, I don't necessarily think is problematic. It's sort of in the way that they write the flavor text, in the way that they flavor and portray the subclasses, I think, as well as like just the general mechanical presentation of it beyond just those like key, because those are the key, no pun intended, those are the key aspects of a monk.
Nice.
Yes, I do think I've seen some interesting discourse online about how people have flavored their monks in an attempt to move away from the Orientalist, like kung fu, right, whatever trope. They've flavored their monks to be like Catholic monks, or what is it, like with the shaved, sort of like from like in Disney's Robin Hood, there's like that bear monk with the shaved head.
Yeah. Oh, like the friar?
Yes, friar, yes. Like, I've seen people do monks like as friars, which I think is interesting, but again, it's like sort of bringing it back to a Western European understanding of fantasy and of medievalness, let's say. So my feelings on the monk class are pretty mixed, because I feel like the people who made it probably weren't Asian, but you can tell that they did a good amount of research, which is sort of like the next point that I want to bring up, which is when you're trying to portray cultures that don't belong to you, of course, whenever people talk about this, the first thing we bring up is research. You want to do your research, right? You don't want to just sort of draw on your own biased understanding without doing a single Google search into what you're trying to portray. But I think it goes beyond research, because even if you research like the exact bread that was used in this like milieu, right? Or like if you research the exact kind of fermentation process for this like specific kind of like Asian beer or whatever, like that's great. But you can still, research is not enough. It's also, this is a question that a lot of critical media studies, academics and scholars continue to grapple with, this question of representation, this question of who gets to tell whose stories. And it is not there's no set answer, right? And anyone telling you that there is, I wouldn't trust what they say. I would say it's more of a series of questions, and the better questions you ask, perhaps the better your processes can become. It's less about the end product and more about the process that creates the product, I would say. So when I look at the monk class, yeah, I'm looking at what I have on the plate, right? Like that's what's in front of me, but I'm also looking at everything that went into creating the monk class. Did they have cultural sensitivity, consultants on board? Were the people writing it and editing it Asian? Did they even care about that? What was their intention in creating the monk class? Did they just want to like add a little bit of, let's add some Eastern spice into this player's handbook here? Or were they actually genuinely interested in branching out beyond Western medieval Europe? I think all of these questions are important when we consider the ways we are constructing our fantasy worlds. Which actually, if it's okay with you, that actually brings me to sort of like the next thing I want to talk about when we talk about colonial ways of approaching fantasy. It's not just in the setting, right? It's not just in, is it set in basically fantasy Europe, or is it set in like fantasy China or whatever? It's also in the ways we tell stories themselves, in the narrative game loop, right? I think a very classic way of playing D&D, when we think about the dungeon crawl, right, is, let's go out into this unmapped wilderness. This could be like, literally the wilderness, or it could be a dungeon, like a long forgotten tomb, or whatever, right? It's uncharted, unexplored. Let's go out here, let's chart it, let's explore it. Let's kill the goblins or the orcs or the savages that live here. Let's take their treasure, right? And let's expand the kingdom. And this sort of game loop is a very colonial way of approaching storytelling, because it's a little uncomfortably close to what has actually happened and continues to happen in the world today, right? Let's go out into this quote-unquote unexplored, but like unexplored on whose terms, right? Area. Let's kill these savages. Doesn't matter, because they're inherently evil or they're inherently godless, right? This idea, this colonialist way of approaching, like, kill the savage, but like save the man, right? When it comes to ways that we, colonial folks look at indigenous people, and let's take their treasure, let's take their land, and let's use it to expand our own power. And that's where I think a lot of the discourse around orcs, I want to like discourse is maybe what it's called. I think that's where a lot of that comes in, because a lot of people are like, hey, y'all, the way that orcs are portrayed seems kind of racist. The way that goblins are portrayed seem a little anti-Semitic. This seems racist, seems whatever. And that's why I feel like it's really frustrating when a common response is, you're racist for thinking orcs are black people. Because that, whenever people bring that up, I always think of the Key and Peele sketch. If you don't know Key and Peele, they're a comedy duo. Jordan Peele, director, writer of Get Out, is a part of this duo. Where you can look it up. I think it's called Country Music or something, or like, this is what country music is. Basically, it's like two friends hang out in their basement. They're both black. One of the friends is like, I started learning guitar. I want to share these country music songs that I've learned with you. He starts playing it, and it's very clear right from the jump that, these songs are dog whistles for, like, he's singing about like the dark, homies who are gonna like assault this like white girl. And his other friend is like, hey man, that's a really racist song. But the guy playing the guitar is like, no, it's not. You're racist for thinking it's racist. How do you know that the homies I'm singing about aren't white? Like, what could be a white homie? Could be an Asian homie. And it's just so ridiculous, because I feel like I'm looking at this thing, this orc, right? That is a specter constructed by white imagination, by the Western imagination, to represent a whole gamut of marginalized people. The orc represents not just, Black people or Native American people. It can also represent Mongolian people, Chinese people. It is whatever the monster is, whatever the creator of the monster wants it to be, to justify violence, to justify fear, right? So it's so obvious to me looking at it. So when someone says, I don't see it, I'm like, are we literally not seeing the same thing? Like, are you like literally incapable of taking off your white supremacist tinted glasses and looking at this thing with unclouded judgment? But go ahead.
I think there was another one was the drow, and when I originally played a drow, I'm very bad at reading the lore of things. I'm like, ooh, cool, a shiny thing, and I play it.
Sure.
And then I'll read the lore later, or somebody else will point something out, and then I'll start to read it and look into it. I'm like, oh crap, you're right. So like with the drow specifically, they were punished and turned darker skinned, which goes with that whole people who are dark are evil, which is not true, and like leads towards that racism aspect as well. So then there was a lot of people who were like, why does the drow have to go down this route when it makes more sense that they would actually be paler because they are underground?
Yes,
it would make more sense for them to be almost translucent, if anything. So I like when I originally played, I was like, "Ooh, cool, a new elf race," and then instead there was something deeper and more congealed. And granted, it was probably started in the 70s when the drows were potentially invented the first time, and it just became, oh well, that's part of the lore. That's part of the lore. That's part of the lore, and it just keeps going forever.
Definitely, for sure. And whenever people bring up, I've seen like arguments online where people are like, "Oh, drow aren't racist. They're literally black skinned. They represent, the darkness in our hearts, right? Like the blackness isn't a racial commentary. It's just about darkness. It's just about being evil, right?" To which my real only response to that is read Toni Morrison, like read Playing in the Dark: Whiteness of the Literary Imagination by Toni Morrison. This is like a book that came out in the 90s, and Toni Morrison talks about how darkness, the trope of darkness in literature specifically, but I think this maps very well onto gaming as well, is racialized, and it's sort of like racism, this specter, is something that, especially in the US, we can't outrun, we can't escape. It is our legacy. It is the seed that our tree came from. So to sort of deny that seed is to deny your own history and to deny your own roots. And when it comes, I hope, what I'm talking about, I feel like isn't very 101. I'm basically assuming a sort of like already baseline knowledge of race relations in the United States here. So if at any point y'all are like confused or like want me to clarify what I'm saying, like just slow me down, let me know, and I can do my best to clarify.
I was actually going to point out that throughout the first 20 minutes of this episode, I have actually sat down and raised my hand like 4 or 5 different times.
Forgetting we're not on video.
Yeah, exactly. Audio only format, but just know that it's happened a couple times. I do have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Will there be a test?
Yes, there will be.
Well, hold on, let me get my notebook.
It is an open note test, so you don't have to worry about that.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's just, this whole thing is it's not a new conversation.
No.
I think it's gaining renewed interest in the mainstream mainstream discourse. I will give you that. But this conversation is one that has been going on for as long as race has been a construct, for as long as there has been a colonial project anywhere in the world, for as long as whiteness as a concept has existed. This conversation has been occurring. So you're not in. When we're talking about anti-racism and anti-colonial things, and how to decolonize our games and be anti-Orientalist with portrayals of non-normative cultures, you're not in bad company. There's a lot of people out here doing this work, and I do not mean to present myself as an expert, in any fashion. This is just something that I've studied for a few years, and I am so open to having a conversation about, and to learning and educating myself, of course.
Right, and there's a lot of questions out there, and a lot of times when people bring up this type of topic, sometimes other people get defensive, and it's not in the sense of like, we're not saying that you specifically are purposefully being racist. We're saying that there are certain things that are ingrained in all of us that we don't even realize are something that we've done before, and then you just teaching yourself and learning and improving, so that going forward that you aren't accidentally hurting people because of your actions or choices of words. And
absolutely,
for me specifically, like, it's been a learning process. I am white. I grew up in a fairly, like, I went to high school with majority non-white, so it was, I think, mostly Hispanic, but there was also a lot of African Americans that went there. And it wasn't until high school that I was actually around more people that weren't like me. And I didn't even realize that there was certain things that were ingrained in my childhood that I was like, oh, well, shit, that was a little racist. That was a little rude. Like, I shouldn't have been thinking that way. But now, as I'm getting older, I'm learning what those things are. Even though I've never purposely targeted anybody, I can see now where certain thoughts could have been on the wrong side of the spectrum. And it doesn't matter if my intentions were there or not. If it still hurts somebody at any point, that's on me to learn and improve and do better. And it's hard to have that talk with yourself sometimes to be like, oh, well, you fucked up.
No, definitely. I hear you. It's again, it's not a destination, it's a continuous journey. And there's that saying that the first thought that comes into your mind, right, is what society has ingrained into you. The second thought, that's all you. So I honestly have a big problem with, I think it's about a culture of Christianity that's very prevalent in America, of this idea that thoughts can be sinful. This idea that just because you had a racist thought means you're a racist person. I think having racist thoughts means that you were brought up in a racist society, right? You can't escape it. It's the subliminal messaging. It's the propaganda that's drilled into us from day one, from when we're still in the womb, right? Right. It's the second thought. It's how we beat back that first thought that determines our character. It's the, no, I refuse to think about an Asian person this way, or like I refuse to buy into this myth, that's been fed to me since day one. It's the second thought that matters, and more than that, much more than that, it's what actually comes out of your mouth, and it's what you actually do. Because I'm not here to thought police anyone. You can think whatever the hell you want, and I don't care because I can't read your thoughts. They can't hurt me. You're not Professor X. You can't psychically. It's fine. Like, think whatever. It's the second thought that matters, and it's what you do and what you say, and that other people can receive and perceive that counts, in my opinion.
I like that quote. It's the first thought is what was ingrained in you, and the second thought is what matters. I like that because I think a lot of people hate on themselves for having that first thought, and it's not intentional. And to the same point, going off of this topic, the first thought sometimes for somebody who has anxiety is usually to the most extreme situation possible.
Totally.
So like I've walked down the street where I'm just like, I'm gonna die immediately. That's my first thought, because like that person's suspicious as fuck, and then it's just like some guy on a walk, and after I think for a second, I'm like, oh, never mind, we're good. I'm fine.
I told you I would stop walking by you when you're outside. I've kept to that promise, thankfully, so I apologize for any previous issues there.
Yeah, no, but I hear what you're saying. It's super, like that first, I'm someone who can struggle sometimes with intrusive thoughts. So, maybe like a trigger warning for a suicidal ideation. But sometimes, when I'm like standing by like a train stop, my brain will be like, jump. My brain's going to be like, jump. Or like I'm holding a knife and my brain's going to be like, why don't you cut your, and I treat that first thought, that first intrusive thought, similarly to how I treat intrusive, sudden, just like racist or sexist or homophobic thoughts, even though I'm like I'm a queer Chinese person, right? I'm like, why am I hating on myself? Like, why is all this coming up? But it's a second thought. It's the way that I deal with it that counts, right? I keep cutting my cucumber. I just keep waiting at the train station. I talk myself down, right? And it's a lot of, everything's connected, right? Like it's therapy will help you become a better person. Yeah. And when it comes to developing strategies and ways of becoming less racist in our games, and how we play, I say this a lot, but I really think that this needs to happen more. And maybe it's because, in high school, I did this kind of extremely awesome social justice immersive program that has basically shaped me into the person that I am today, that I highly encourage everyone to donate to and maybe send their kids to if you're in the greater Boston area, called INIT. And it is a program sponsored by the Boston YWCA. Basically a program that takes a bunch of high school aged youth, anywhere I think from 9th to 12th grade, and for a week they sort of bus them out to like wherever, like in the suburbs of Boston, and for a week it's a facilitated week-long immersive discussion and like activity series, workshops that teach you about racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, immigration. I think these are the 5 major topics that they touch on. And it's like not only like a crash course 101, what is racism, but also a facilitated conversation, that can get extremely intense. Like I remember during like the race workshop, they split us, into people of color and white people, so all the kids of color went into one room and all the white kids went into another room, and adults, trained, educated facilitators, who identified along those racial lines would go into those rooms and just have a conversation. So not only were the people of color able to talk about racism, away from white people in a way, so we could have like an unfiltered conversation. But after we came back and talked, obviously I wasn't in the white person room, but we heard, from folks who were, and my friends who were in the white person room, were like, the white people room, were like, yeah, it was really weird to be in a room full of white people and have like these white facilitators be like, all right, let's talk about how we've been racist, away from people of color. So what they said couldn't hurt people of color, right? So they could say pretty much, they could say those thoughts that's been in their brains, they could say these like myths, these horrible like racist things they've been taught, but away from the people that are affected by it. And in a facilitated context where, there were adults, there were educators and mentors there to be like, all right, what you're saying is a little too racist. Let's reel that back. Why do you feel that way? And it was extremely generative. It helped not just the people of color, but also the white kids, be able to be like, oh, this is a safe space for us to talk about how we as white people have fucked up and have hurt other people. And I think more of that needs to happen. I think more white people, need to get educated and, learn facilitation skills and, take your white friends aside, put them in a room. It's just y'all, talk about how you've been racist and talk about how you can move on from that. It's similar to men. I wish more men would get educated, talk to other men, bring your, male friends into a room and be like, hey, let's talk about rape culture. Hey, let's talk about that joke you sent to the group text the other day about, our female friend that made me uncomfortable, et cetera. I wish more of that would happen. And the more of that discourse that occurs in actual society, I think it's going to leak over to, gaming communities, because the classic quote, like, art is a reflection of life. Life is also a reflection of art. And the more that our society changes, for the better, I think the more our art will change for the better. But yeah, I'm going to pause to take a sip of water and let y'all talk and ask questions and respond to that.
I think that's I actually really like that program that you mentioned. That sounds like something that everybody should step into. I know that there are a couple of friends that I have that are white, and they do step out and they say something and they're like, hey, no, that's racist. Like, you need to stop. And I tend to be one of the people where I don't call it out in the moment. I will like think about it and then I'll go to them privately and say something and say, I don't think this is what you intended, but this was a little weird. But there are friends that I have that will straight up just say it to somebody's face, and I admire their courage. That's not the right word. Their lack of their ability to handle confrontation without having a panic attack.
I was going to say, very non-confrontational for sure.
So I think that's actually really smart though to separate the two, because I have heard from watching other people talk about race who are people of color, they mentioned like, we said something and it wasn't until I was alone with people who were like me that I could actually be like, oh shit, yeah, I'm not crazy. I'm not the only one thinking this. Other people are thinking this too. I'm not just being that guy or that girl at the table. And then white people, if they had their own room and they were able to talk, they can talk openly and honestly with each other, without hurting anybody, like you mentioned, without saying something like, hey, well, you're black, you're Asian.
Yeah.
Would this be upsetting if I did this?
Yeah, that I can see how that could spiral very quickly.
And that's not the intent, I don't think, either. It's like, and there's a lot of people on Twitter specifically where these conversations are happening that I'm seeing the most, where people are being asked and they'll say something, a person of color will say something and they'll see like, this isn't okay, and they're calling something out, and then people are asking them questions in the conversation, and then the original poster is getting mad, which just I completely understand. They're like, it's not my job to educate you. It's not my job to do a Google search for you. You need to research it yourself. And I completely see their side of it. But then at the same time, the other person is like, well, I'm just trying to learn, but they're going about it the wrong way. So it's a strange balance. Like, you have to see both sides, and not everybody is seeing both sides, and not the person asking the question originally isn't going to see that this person's been asked 82 questions just since yesterday. especially if they have like 40,000 followers
Yes.
right now. They're being bombarded with questions and the same question over and over again.
For sure. I mean, what I will say about that is there's a reason that the immersive experience I talked about happened, first of all, in an isolated sort of like we went to this isolated estate, basically, where all we did, we committed to talking about these difficult things for a week, and it was in person. I do not think Twitter is the place to be having, they can be where these conversations begin, but they cannot be where these conversations end. And you can't facilitate. You can't fucking facilitate a Twitter talk. Like any dude could jump in and say whatever. And like what you say, you'd have no idea how that's going to be interpreted, right, or misconstrued or taken out of context. Which is honestly, I think Twitter has its uses, but it also is not. It's like trying to take down a tree with a switchblade. You can maybe, you could try, but it's not going to work. Like you're going to have to expand your horizons on your own. You're going to have to put in a little bit of elbow grease, on your own side. Yeah. And
the same can be said of any social media as a whole.
Absolutely.
So are there any game systems or campaigns that you know of that aren't Homebrew that you think treated this correctly, like handled it correctly?
Okay, so when I think about supplements or adventures that have been written that have done it pretty well, I do think of homebrew supplements like for 5th edition that other people have made. Specifically, the first thing that jumps into my mind is the Unbreakable anthology series. Okay. I own it. It's great. It's for, by, and about Asian people. It's sort of like a delayed response to Oriental Adventures. And it's a bunch of adventures, really cool, from like 1st to 20th level for 5th edition, set in like, Asian settings, ranging from, like Hong Kong in the 50s, I want to say, to like the medieval Philippines. It's super diverse and it's very specific. Which I really appreciate. And I am looking forward to running some of these adventures in my own campaign. That's the first thing I think of. The second thing I think of is there's a lot of really cool indie games out there being made by people of color. And among them, I actually did like a lecture series about this a little while ago. And I'm going to pull up my notes right now, if that's okay, to just sort of list them.
Yeah, go for it.
We can also put the link to the lecture series if it's available.
Yes, we can certainly do that. Let's see, where is it? Here it is. And Dake Understood. It's really interesting. I uploaded this specific lecture to YouTube. This specific lecture where I talk about like all the cool projects that various people of color are doing. And it is, I think, the only video that we have on our Transplanar RPG YouTube channel that has dislikes on it, which makes me think that it's not even like the lecture where I, am the most controversial. I'm just like boosting other people's projects, which I think is really funny. Let's see.
That reminds me of like the people who, when it's like an art Twitter and then they post something that's like talking about racism, they're like, I'm here for your art. You can't talk about this type of thing on here. And it's like, I can talk about whatever I want.
Literally, oh my god, that's so annoying to me. Hold on. Just one moment. I'm so glad this is a podcast and not a live stream.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right?
That's why I like podcasts for. Especially since I'm pretty sure earlier you heard my kid go cookies when they came into the room.
I don't recall hearing that, but if
it's there, you might as
now
well
we know
leave
what happened. Cool. Will do.
Yeah. I think I was in the middle of talking anyway when it was.
Okay, well there you go.
I found my list. It's not just adventures or systems, but these are also like podcasts and live streams that are sort of doing this work, I would say. The first one that comes to mind is Utopia TV. I'm not sure if you've heard of them, but they are a variety tabletop streaming channel with very diverse programming. They do one-shots, they do like long-term campaigns, they do like talk shows, they just like hang out sometimes, made for, by, and about Black, Indigenous, and people of color. They're really awesome. I'm playing in one of their campaigns, and the GM Miriam is awesome, and the players are awesome, and it's just a really cool, I think, very new and at this point pretty underrated channel. You can find them pretty much everywhere at Utopia TV. The second one that I encourage everyone to check out is Prism Pals. Prism Pals is, I'm not sure if you're aware of them, they're an actual play podcast, and they use the Quest RPG system instead of like 5th edition or anything like that. And Prism Pals features queer people, and I'm pretty sure they're majority people of color. And they're also family friendly, I'm pretty sure, with their programming. So if you have kids, or friends with kids or youth, Prism Pals is a really great show to put them on Quest RPG with.
Nice.
Yeah, for sure. And I mentioned Unbreakable Volume 1. They're like Asian-made D&D 5th edition supplements, adventures. They're on, I think, Drive-Thru RPG. You can buy either, I think, a PDF or hardcover, and it's super worth it. The hardcover, I love having like actual physical like books in my hands, and I love smelling the pages, and the pages smell really nice. So that's my weird review of Unbreakable Volume 1.
You heard it here first, guys.
You heard it here first.
Or second.
I'm pretty sure the Kickstarter is over for this particular project next, but it is called Jiangshi Blood in the Banquet Hall. It is a brand new tabletop game made by an Asian/Chinese team. Basically, you play as a Chinese family that owns a restaurant, and by day you fight racism and make food, but by night you fight hopping vampires, which is what Jiangshi are. And it's it's really cool. It blends family drama with monsters. I'm not sure if the Kickstarter is still happening, but if you look it up, you can definitely follow them and follow their creators on Twitter.
You can pre-order it now, but the Kickstarter ended 5 days ago.
Cool. Yeah, so you can pre-order Jiangshi Blood in the Banquet Hall. I'm pretty sure they use a system of clocks to sort of track progress and up the stakes when you need to as a GM on your players. So that's a really cool mechanic that you should look into and buy Jiangshi because of.
Nice.
Yeah, there's another project, another tabletop game called Monster Care Squad, Legends of Ald Amura, which is also similar to Jiangshi. It's a brand new tabletop game. I'm pretty sure the Kickstarter ended, but I could be wrong. It is set in sort of like a Studio Ghibli-esque kind of like soft fantasy world, where your goal as players isn't to kill, but cure monsters of a magical disease called, I think, the false gold. The art is beautiful, the concept is really unique, and the mechanics look really stellar. And the team behind it is really talented and diverse. I would totally check them out.
They also
if I were you.
Have finished, but they have
Cool.
late pledges available.
Great. Yeah, look into that if you have some spare moolah lying around. The next sort of RPG I want to highlight is a Bolt RPG by Ajay, who is a I got a Twitch alert. Sorry, on my phone. It is a self-described sort of system agnostic, crunchy, hackable, story-driven tabletop system that I'm pretty sure utilizes a D10 plus D4 system. It sort of describes itself as blending narrative ideals, so really story-driven game with tactical combat, and it's super hackable. I think the Kickstarter is still happening because I backed it, but it's ending very soon. And if it ends before this,
it will be over. It ends in 60 minutes.
Oh wow.
Well done.
Yeah, that's very soon. But you can still follow Ajay on Twitter and follow Bolt RPG on Twitter and track what they're up to. The mechanics are really cool, and I think you should really check it out. I'm pretty sure like a preview is on itch, available on itch. And of course, you can't talk about RPGs, tabletop and diversity without talking about Swordsfall RPG, which is an original. It's I'm pretty sure it's not a tabletop system, or it's not yet a tabletop system, but it is an original Afropunk science fantasy setting. And it's also sort of like a book and comic series as well. They have like a world anvil where they have a bunch of, lore about the Swordsfall universe. They have like merch stores open. You can just Google Swordsfall RPG. It'll come up. It's super great. It's Afrofuturist, Afropunk, science fantasy. that it's awesome. And sort of the last kind of podcast that's sort of been circulating in my orbit is Fast Times at D&D High, which I think it debuted maybe a couple months ago, but other than that, they're a really brand new sort of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons podcast. I know there's a ton of us out there, but I think what sets them apart is they're modern fantasy, it's homebrew. Pretty much everyone in their cast is queer, trans, and or a person of color. And they're super friendly. And yeah, the creators are great. And they're doing some really cool stuff with their story. But these are basically like some projects and systems and engines out there that have been made by, for, and about people of color that are sort of circulating in my orbit.
That is a lot. I linked most of those in the discussion for us.
Great.
Be sure to add to the description. So if you guys want to check out any of those, you can find the links down below.
Wonderful. Thank you for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for bringing them up.
Absolutely. And there's so much more than just like the handful that I listed. There's so much content out there. There's a thriving tabletop community in the Philippines. There's a lot of like really cool Filipinx creators and streamers out there. Like it's really awesome. And there is a wealth of content out there for, by, and about people of color. And all you have to do is do a little bit of Googling and you'll find them.
I've heard a couple of those. I know Bolt's been going around on Twitter a lot. I've heard of Swords Fall before, and I think Prism Pals, I've seen you share about them before, so I think I've already was following them.
Awesome.
But I haven't had a chance to listen to their show yet.
For sure.
I am excited to do so. And that actually answered like 3 of the questions I had, so that's exciting.
Great.
I know that when we were talking, you were mentioning that there are a couple of books and media that's out there that is good to get people started in learning and like educating. You mentioned one so far. Are there any books in particular that you think everybody should read if they want to understand a little bit better?
Oh, let me just bust out my college syllabus. Oh my god. So a lot of the texts I would want to recommend are pretty dense. And honestly, I don't know how accessible they are. Like frankly, especially to people who are just learning about this sort of thing. How does it sound to you? I can try to come up with like a list, like in a Google Doc, and share it with you, like just of preliminary like resources that might be out there that folks can read. There's also, I mentioned Toni Morrison, I mentioned Edward Said. I also think it's important to read texts that aren't just nonfiction or just purely academic, like branching out into reading like fiction or poetry, by people of color, by people who aren't American, by queer people. And I can, I'm honestly someone, especially after graduating college, like my brain was so full of all these texts, I immediately turned toward fiction and toward like prose, to sort of fill, I think, what was missing in my soul as a creative person. So when it comes to poetry and poets, I think you should read, because I don't think you should just read academic texts about this sort of thing to really get to the soul of why this shit matters. I think you have to read poetry. I think you have to read fiction. I think you have to read prose. Frankly, and maybe that's just because I like to write poetry. But some poets I can recommend right off the bat, who talk about race and racism and white supremacy. Justin Philip Reed, I think recently came out with a Malevolent volume, also did Indecency. Ocean Vuong, Night Sky with Exit Wounds, I think. Exit is a great book of poems. Obviously, I have to recommend Mary Oliver. She doesn't really talk about race, but she's just a great poet. It talks about tenderness. And we actually, something that Transplanar does, that I very specifically decided for us to do, and very intentionally, is all of the titles of each of our episodes is actually a line of poetry taken from a poet of color, an international poet, a queer and or trans poet. And we have a thread on our Twitter. It's in our pinned tweet on Transplanar RPG, where we link to a bunch of poets. It includes Justin Philip Reed, includes Ocean Vuong, that I highly recommend folks check out for, poetry by women, by queer people, by trans people, by international writers, etc. But yeah, other than that, like if you're really interested in like, racism, colonialism, and Orientalism, like 101, there's a lot of resource lists that have already been compiled out there. You can Google for them. The work of putting together resources is a hard one, I would say, especially if you're trying to link to PDFs that are free or available online that people don't have to pay for. I was talking to my partner about this the other day, actually. I was like, I really want to like compile a public free Google Doc of just like, media analysis, critical media analysis, like works, PDFs out there. And they very rightly pointed out, first of all, I have so much on my plate already. And second of all, doing such a thing is actually kind of a full-time job. Like people, it's like an archivist job. It's hard work. But I would be more than happy to share, just sort of off the top of my head, more recommendations I might have and just sort of shoot them over to you in a DM that you can maybe add to the show notes.
Yeah, for sure. That sounds like a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
I know that I haven't read in a while. Like I've read a couple of books, but when I was on this huge reading spree, I read a really good book, and I'm trying to find the name of it right frickin' now, and I cannot find it. One book that I remember was Book Thief is one. It more focuses on the Jewish people in the Holocaust, but it focused on the perspective of someone who wasn't necessarily Jewish, but wasn't a Nazi. And I literally cried when reading that book.
Yes, The Book Thief. I definitely remember reading that when I was younger and it having a huge impact on me.
I read it as an adult. I never, I didn't hear about it until a couple of years ago, but it was such a good book. And it was really interesting and put in a lot of perspective how we get to the point where, because I think some questions specifically related to Nazis are like, well, why didn't somebody do something about it if they weren't Nazis but weren't Jewish? And it puts that into perspective.
Totally.
Of how easy it is for people to just kind of like hide and not say something because they're afraid, and what they do to help out, what they can do, and even though it's risky, they'll like do a little bit of something to kind of help as much as they can. And I cried during that book. There was another one I read that I am trying to find. I think it's called Fortune's Son, but I need to. Why do I have so many books? I don't understand. I think it's called Fortune's Son, but I'm trying to find it. But it was really good. It was about it fell into the racism and seeing the different side of things.
Yes.
I will find it and tell Greg and put the link down below. Oh, there it is. Fortunate Son by Walter Mosley. And it was a book about this white guy had a baby and his wife, I think, passed away. And he had a black woman and her baby join him in their house and said, here's the deal. You can live here for free if you just help me take care of my son. And they became friends. But then something happened, and like the one black boy and one white boy were raised together in this household and raised like siblings. But then the one son's mother died, and suddenly he was forced to go into a world that he wasn't familiar with his father. And he had to go into this completely different world and experience what it's like to be on the opposite side of things. And it was him and his brother, quote unquote, and their extreme differences in how they were both raised because of their race. And he got to see both sides of it. And it was really impactful because you don't really think about it sometimes. And it was very unique in their perspective, I think, on how it was done. So I do recommend that one as well. So we do have a couple of Twitter questions.
Yes. Oh, before we get to the Twitter questions, while you were talking, actually, it made me think of a few other recommendations that I do have for our lovely listeners, if that's all right.
Go for it.
Great. So one of them that I have is called Braiding Sweetgrass. It's by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she is an Indigenous woman and scientist who talks about the who talks about the central role of the natural world, and our relationship as human beings to it. And it's very much an indigenous perspective, and I think it's a super important book that you can buy, I think, through Milkweed Press. I would not recommend buying it through Amazon because fuck Amazon, right? The other book that I would like to recommend is the classic by James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. It was released during the Civil Rights era, but it is, still very relevant, I think, for obvious reasons. And it's a great sort of, it's a series of essays, basically, is the best way I can describe it, that talks about race. And it talks about race in a very thoughtful, insightful way that I would recommend anyone to read if you haven't read it already. But yeah, we can move on to Twitter questions, but these are just two more books I wanted to throw out there. Oh, and in terms of fiction, the Tenserate series by J.Y. Yang. I always get the initials mixed up. J.Y. Yang. Yes, J.Y. Yang. The Tenserate series is self-described silk punk. It is by a Singaporean writer, non-binary, and it is set in sort of like a Asian like fantasy world that feels very specific, and it doesn't feel Orientalist at all. And I think it is a fantastic example of like non-normative fantasy done right. And it's super gay also. It's like super, super gay, and it's very trans and very queer. And more than that, the prose is immaculate. It is some of the most interesting prose I've read in a long time.
Nice.
Yeah, so I'm
going to add that to a list that I have going from this episode already, and I will definitely be checking that one out.
Yes, it is awesome. Definitely check it out.
Awesome. I'm going to have so much reading and listening that I need to do with all the time I have.
Same.
All right, so we have 4 questions. So Ellen from Birdhouse Mysteries asks, what is the number one thing a GM could do to make sure that they don't fall into a harmful colonialist stereotype when building a world and plot threads?
Aside from what I think is the obvious, which is research, I would say read texts. Again, this is also a big reason why I'm recommending not just nonfiction texts. Consume a diversity of media by the people that you're trying to represent. Consume poetry. When I was doing research, I looked at dance and like food making videos, from culture that didn't belong to me. And make sure that, the kinds of media you're consuming, not just the media is diverse, but the people, like, are you watching, a dance video made by an elder, are you watching a dance video made by someone who's young, of that culture? Are you reading poetry written by exclusively straight and cis men, who belong to that heritage? Or are you also like reading, and listening to women, and queer people and trans people? That would be my second recommendation for, building homebrew worlds and settings and adventures or NPCs or what have you, that aren't offensive, let's say. And my third, tip would just be to be open to criticism. This definitely seems like a no-brainer, but it's really vital. Be open to being wrong. Because, when we are committing to the work of representing marginalized identities, both our own and also those that don't necessarily belong to us, we are committing to being wrong, and we are committing to fucking up. And that's just part of the process. It's as natural to, this sort of work as, flying is to a bird. You will mess up, and you have to be okay with that. That would be my third tip.
Yeah, you have to be committed to learning. So
yes,
that you don't continue to mess up.
Exactly, it's a continuous journey for sure.
Cora Eckert asks, "What are some of your favorite homebrew creations you're influenced by from other TTRPG creators that you have found?" Which you mentioned quite a few earlier, so I think you already covered that one.
I was Cora Also, hi Cora. Was Cora specifically referring to like other folks' homebrew creations, or were they talking more specifically about Transplanar?
It says, what are some favorite homebrew creations you're influenced by from other TTRPG creators that you have found? When creating your custom homebrew mechanics, like the faster paced fight system, what do you take into account?
Oh, cool. Yeah. I can talk a little bit. I'm not sure if we've talked about my accelerated combat system or relationship building mechanic yet
No,
or
but
before.
I wanted to know more about that when you mentioned it on Twitter.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So specifically when it comes to accelerated combat, I was influenced by Monster of the Week. I was influenced by the Apocalypse engine. I really was very enamored with how narrative but also like fast-paced combat was. So obviously we all know 5th edition, it can take literally forever to get through a combat encounter, especially if you have more than 3 players. Especially if you have like NPCs traveling with you too. It can take like the entire session to get through like a bandit raid, which can be appealing to your players, but for me as a GM and to my players, we want combat, but we don't want it to take forever. Which was how and why I birthed the accelerated combat system. I specifically developed this system to work on the road. I built it when I knew that we were going to have at least one episode of just traveling. We were just going to travel, and I was like, well, I don't want to just like roll on random encounter tables, because how does that relate to the greater themes we're exploring in the narrative? What are the stakes here beyond just let's not get killed by bandits, right? That's not really interesting. So I built accelerated combat for fights to feel cinematic, but also have a mechanical component. And that was influenced by me playing in a Masks campaign. Masks is a game using the powered by the Apocalypse system, basically like teenage superheroes. And, just based on like movies, honestly, more so than other games, like watching movies and how combat works in movies, you sort of describe a series of actions, right? When we look at how like combat scenes are shot and written in screenplays, and this, I was also drawing on my experience as a screenwriter for how I wanted this mechanic to go. So basically the bare bones of this mechanic are first of all, you tell your players they're in accelerated combat. And the stakes as I've written them is that the trade-off is accelerated combat is never lethal. So it can feel a little bit like you don't want to die during accelerated combat, because that would suck, right? Because that feels like taking some agency away from players, because we are still playing in 5th edition, right? And I don't want folks to just mess up on a single like roll in accelerated combat and like not get to roll death rolls and they just die. So that's the trade-off. The players can't die, and the people they're fighting can't die. But but other like negative states can occur. Like you could, get all knocked out and captured. One of you could get kidnapped. Your weapons could break. You could get lasting wounds or lasting injuries, that affect you mechanically for the rest of your travel, or in perpetua until you figure out how to get rid of it. And how the mechanics work is there are 3 roles. The first one is what I call a fight roll. The second one is what I call a wound roll. And the third one is what I call an inspired roll. And that's it. They're all D20 rolls. And these rolls and how well you do on them determine how the combat goes. Yes, so fight roll determines how well you fight in the combat, basically how effective you are, and I allow folks to choose whether they want to focus on martial fighting or their magical attacks, especially if they're like multi-class or can do both. The wound roll determines how much their ass gets kicked, like how much damage you take from the fight. Do you get knocked out, like if it's a nat 1, or do you do really well and not get injured at all? And the third roll is completely up to the players. This is basically their moment to shine. With the fight roll and the wound roll factored in, what do you want to do to really kick ass and shine? So someone, has used the inspired roll before to do like a really cool acrobatic maneuver, someone else has used it to, figure out like, oh, what's the monster's like greater motivations here? I feel like they're not just attacking just to attack. Like, can I like roll insight? And I allow like an inspired roll to be rolled like a skill check. While both fight and wound rolls, I roll a fight roll like an attack roll, and I roll a wound roll like a saving throw. But I let the players choose, how they want to attack, how they want to dodge. Are they mostly going to be relying on their dexterity, in which case for the wound roll I call for a dex save? Are they mostly going to be relying on their like big muscles, in which case I'll call for a constitution save? Or if they can convince me to use a different kind of saving throw, I might allow it. So yeah, it's very freeform, and the players basically take the lead in describing how the combat goes based on the outcome of their rolls.
Oh, that's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Like that. I would try to convince you every time to let my bard use her charisma save to talk her way out of a danger. Every time.
That's really funny. I might allow that as a GM. But yeah.
You heard it here,
yeah,
guys. Use it for your game in the future.
Oh yeah, I need to still like put the rules in a presentable fashion and put them online. But that is something I'm hoping to develop. And it makes for really punchy cinematic combat. And my players have had a lot of fun with it. There was a little bit of like a stumbling block. I was definitely using them as guinea pigs to play test it when we first did it, and I took the feedback that they had and I sort of tweaked how I presented it. The second time we did it, but the second time we did accelerated combat, it went really, really awesome. All my players like felt like they kicked ass. They felt like the combat was just long enough, and they felt like it had a great outcome.
So once they do all your rolls, do you describe what happened?
I tell them. Okay. I make them describe it. Yeah. Okay. Because how I usually like to resolve not just skill checks, but also attack rolls, and this is how Transplanar is a little different from like rules as written 5th edition, is I grade it on a scale of success instead of binary pass fail, which is usually how D&D is, right? Like when we think about a trap, right? Let's say it has like a DC of 15 to detrap it, and if your rogue gets a 14, it's a fail. Like you don't pass it, right? And maybe your thieves' tools even break or something. But I'm pretty different when I'm grading checks. Even if they don't make the DC in my brain, depending on how high they got, I allow them to either give advantage to a different player or like some other contextually dependent situational boon. And this even happens in combat, right? Like if you've seen, any episodes of Transplanar where we did combat, even if my players get like a 9 to hit, and that's obviously not going to hit this huge scaled scorpion creature, I allow them to be like, all right, with your 9, what do you try to do? Even if you don't deal damage, what's your go here? My player has described like, well, I'm going to try to like wedge my knife underneath the plating of this scorpion's armor, and I'll be like, great, you've lowered their AC by 1. So even if you didn't deal damage, with your 9, I'll allow you to do something else interesting with it. Yeah, and it makes combat feel a lot more dynamic. It definitely fucks with the rules of 5th edition, like to a pretty major degree. But I'm like, whatever, I don't care. It makes it more fun, makes it more interesting to me and to my players.
Just immediately thought of a way that you can make that work with like flanking rules too, where you go to attack but you miss, but you give the other person a +1 because now the other person's distracted by dodging their move and that type of stuff.
Exactly. And, it's sort of a give and take. Sometimes I'll decide what the boon is. Sometimes I'll be like, do you have any idea what you want it to be? And sometimes my players will be like, I don't know, you tell me. Or I'll be like, I don't know, you tell me to my players. Something else cool that's happened is our elf sorcerer, most recently in episode 7 that came out maybe 2-3 weeks ago at this point. She was fighting one-on-one against this dragonborn dude from her past, and she failed basically on a acid attack with a chromatic orb. But I say, because you're in close quarters and you're trying to use this acid splash on his face, you don't manage to hurt him, but you do blind him. So he's going to be blinded until the end of his turn. And that sort of helped with combat a little bit. But going back to accelerated combat, I'll usually let my players take the lead because I have a chart that predetermines how successful they are. So they know based on their roll, I'll be like, all right, you're trying to hit this number. You rolled a 14. That's not quite going to make it. It's not quite within the range for it to be a success. So you describe to me how, your fight roll is not quite a success. And my players might be like, oh, maybe this means that, I don't know. I try to get my sword out of my, scabbard, but it takes me a while because we just woke up in the middle of the night and I'm not really effective until halfway into the fight. And that's why, my fight roll is only halfway successful. I'll let my players take the lead because we both know, what the result means. I just let them determine how they get there.
That actually sounds like a lot of fun, and
yeah.
I love, don't get me wrong, 5th edition is usually my go-to game, even though I love some other systems, but the combat takes so long. And there are days, like I literally had a 3-hour session that was a minute in combat.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
That sounds so frustrating.
It was the most epic minute of these players' lives, but it was a minute of combat, and I'm just like, okay,
Yep.
I'm tired. I need to go to sleep. Bye.
Yeah, I hear you. It can be really exhausting and really hard for the GM too, because you're like, that was epic, but it's been literally 4 seconds.
It's like, so no, seriously, it's only been 20 seconds in game. God, dang it. Okay, next round, let's go. So the next question is Tales of Asperon. Mike, he asks, how do you feel about anti-colonial stories, and what part can they play in a non-colonial homebrew world?
Well, I think this entire interview of me throwing words at y'all has said that I feel very positively about anti-colonial stories. I think every story needs to be, if not anti-colonial, then non-colonial, or attempting to be non-colonial, because I feel like that's really the baseline, sort of like the bottom bar we should be striving for. And what was the second part of the question?
What part can they play in non-colonial homebrew worlds?
Every part, really. Your homebrew world. So me homebrewing Andake, which is the name of our setting, was and will be labor. It's a lot of work. I knew from the session -1 that I had with my players, which is what I was calling it, we generated sort of a wish list of what we wanted our podcast, now live stream, to be, and pretty much the number one item for my players was, we want a world that feels rich and expansive, first of all, and is non-colonial and anti-Orientalist. Like, we want it to be not set in like a typical Western European. And I was like, okay, great, I'll do this. But when I started building it, I was like, shit, fuck, it's so much work. Being, decolonizing, your setting, like being non-colonial with it, being anti-Orientalist, isn't just like, what's the setting, right? Where are we geographically? It's literally everything. It's the language. It's how the language is presented. It is the customs and the culture and religion. It's how the religion is presented. It is in the food. It's in the dress. It is in what buildings look like. It wasn't until I was like, so there's this one part of the world of Andake, the Republic of Talmud, which is where our characters currently are, that I sort of modeled off of a combination of medieval India as well as the Roman Republic, like post-kingdom, early Republic. Because I'm also a classic scholar, I studied Latin for like 6 years in high school, and there's like a tender part in my heart for like all of that stuff. So I was like, I want to blend these two cultures together. And it wasn't until I started like building Talmud, I was like, okay, great. I had to design like an estate, right? I had to design like a rich person's house, basically. And I was like, okay, I'll just make it a manor. And then I was like, wait, fuck. A manor is Western European. This idea of like a house is European, and that wouldn't exist in medieval India. So I had to look up, what would like a rich person in India, medieval India, live in. And I, looked up a haveli, which is like an estate, sprawling courtyards, with like really cool bas relief carvings and like multiple gardens and an estate that looked nothing like what we think of when we say manor, right? Because we think of like, I don't know, like Wuthering Heights, right? But this is not Wuthering Heights at all. Like, this is like completely different ballgame. So just the amount of research that goes into every aspect of the world is honestly really mind-boggling and staggering. I researched everything from like the food, to like, what language sounds like, to I mentioned earlier, like the dance forms that are there, what theater houses look like. It's a lot, what people dress in. It's not just like, it's easy to default to suit and tie, or like, a paladin's armament when we think of armor, but like when we think about like, a non-Western kind of armor, it's not just that. It's probably something more robe-like, more flowy. But I don't just want to describe it as a flowy robe, because what the fuck does that mean, right? Yeah. I have to do my research. So there's a lot of that.
That actually leads us into the final question from the Iron Realm. He wanted to know, do you research real-world history as part of your game prep? And if so, what sources do you consult? But you obviously research real-world history if you're looking up specific naming and what things look like from the places that you are basing these worlds off of, which is amazing. Because like you mentioned, like I would immediately go to like manor. That's like it's a mansion, it's a big house. Like
Right, exactly.
boom,
Yeah.
done. But that makes perfect sense if you're basing it in a completely different country. That's not what you're gonna see, because this isn't Europe, this isn't America, this is India, or based off of India.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I'm sure I fucked up already. Like, I might have described, oh, you see this man cutting into a steak with a fork and a knife, and then I have to pause and be like, would they even use a fork and knife? Like, would they even be cutting into steak in the way that we think of steak? Like, what would be the rich person food of this time? Like, it wouldn't be steak, it'd be something else, right? So, yes, to answer the question, yes, I do definitely research real world cultures, and I try to be, honestly, really transparent about my inspirations, both for two reasons. One is so it's more easy to be held accountable if I fuck up, right? So I can't be like, ooh, well, this isn't actually based off of medieval India. You're just being sensitive, because I think that's a really shitty cop-out that a lot of people use. And the second one is so, I can have an easier time doing my research. If I know that this area of the world is based off of like Sengoku period Japan, for instance, I can just sort of Google that and like look at my sources, use Wikipedia and then scroll to the bottom of Wikipedia and use the sources that Wikipedia is using to do my research is usually my go-to research method.
I'm pretty sure that's how I did all of my papers, because in college, he's like, you can't use Wikipedia, but I can use the links on the bottom of Wikipedia.
Yes, Wikipedia's footnotes.
They lead to a not Wikipedia site. There you go. Boom.
They really do.
Paper done.
Yes, honestly, that's how I skated through college too.
There you go. I think we all did.
I just had to find one reference off of the school library website, and then everything else was free game.
Oh
So I found one
yeah.
that made me sound smart, and then everything else was just like Wikipedia footnotes. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and very, very educational.
Yes, indeed.
And I am excited.
I'm glad to hear that.
To try to expand my homebrew worlds, whether for my real game, they're all real games, for my in-life game, or if I ultimately am DMing for a podcast eventually for that, so that I can learn and grow as well. So thank you for talking our ears off and teaching us and spending the hour and a half helping us understand.
You're very welcome.
Definitely. Thank you
totally.
so much. And I'm ready for that. I'm ready for that test now.
It's going to be, I lied, it's actually going to be closed book.
How dare you?
Yeah, you're very welcome. It was honestly, it's such a pleasure to talk on your podcast. I know I definitely talked y'all's ears off. Yeah, I feel like toward the end I was like, I'm running out of steam. But I definitely want to reiterate, I'm not the expert on this in any way. Please expand your reading beyond this. Google anything that might have been interesting to you. Google anti-colonial D&D, or Google like racism D&D and stuff like that. And don't click the link that says racism doesn't exist in D&D, because we all know there's going to be links like that out there.
And then check out everybody that's been mentioned down below. And
yes, and more, for sure. Like, follow marginalized creators, watch our stuff, buy our merch, tip us, join our discords, say hi to us, support us. That's a very tangible way that you can help out. Extremely tangible, very doable. Even if you don't have money, follow us, subscribe to us, etc.
The only game that I would like to mention that wasn't mentioned is Motherlands RPG comes out today on the day of recording.
Oh my god, yes!
Their first episode.
I can't believe I forgot.
Yeah, it's fine. You mentioned a lot, so I completely get it. So Into the Motherlands comes out starting Sunday, October 4th, which this episode is obviously out later than that. But if you haven't heard of them, please go check them out on Twitter. And they are funded by Twitch and led by all people of color developers, cast and crew. And Cypher of the Tier is the one hosting this on her Twitch. So I'm super stoked to check out the VOD after it is done.
Yeah,
being played.
I'm so excited to watch. It's an all black cast. It's gonna be kick ass. Like definitely, this is like I think it's gonna be like I really want it to be like the next Critical Role. You know what I mean? Like I really, I think if anyone can do it, it's them. So yeah.
So I'm very excited. Unfortunately, I will be recording at the time of them being live, but I'm going to check it out tomorrow on the video on demand.
Oh.
But also check out Transplanar because they're fantastic.
Hey, that's us. Yes, you can follow us pretty much everywhere on Transplanar RPG. We're on Twitter, Twitch. That's where we stream. So definitely check us out on Twitch. YouTube, Transplanar RPG. We put past VODs and funny clips and highlights on our YouTube. And we also have an Instagram account, Transplanar RPG. We put up, cool little graphics there. And we have a Tumblr, Transplanar RPG. Just a couple, maybe just a handful.
I mean, you have just a few.
Yeah, and I feel very silly for speaking in a British accent because my greatest weakness as a GM is accents. I cannot do accents. I am very, very, very bad. So there's that too.
You're not the only one. I can do a very bad British accent. And I can do a Southern accent. That's about all I got. And that's not great. I very heavily end up picking up on other people's accents instead, and then forgetting the one I had. And I was like, crap, that's not the one I was using. And then I just go back to me.
Don't feel bad, Nikki. I guarantee you, whatever accent you have, mine is worse. 100%. So don't feel bad.
I'll take you up on that.
Yeah, do not feel bad about it.
But yeah, so thanks again for joining. Everybody go check out Transplanar. Check out all the links down below. There are quite a few of them, but check out all the people and follow all the people and give everybody a listen. If you like them, please also support them by leaving a 5-star review on iTunes and Podchaser.
Oh yes, thank you. We are on Twitch, but you should leave the review for this series.
Also, sure.
Aww.
Do that for Beholders No One.
Well, if you can't leave a 5-star review, then just go subscribe on Twitch and put your money there.
Yes.
Yes.
If you leave a cute comment on our YouTube, we will do our best to highlight it. That's basically our review system. Comments on YouTube. I really wish
they had a review system.
Sweet. Yeah, me too. It would be.
So they're making other stupid stuff on Twitch. Anyway, that's another conversation.
Yeah.
So yeah, you guys can come talk to me on Twitter at Beholders No One, or you can talk to Greg on Facebook at Beholders No One, and you can find our podcast wherever podcasts can be found. And thanks again for joining us, and bye.
Thank you for having me. Peace out.
Bye-bye.